We have Jahangir Aziz online with us, and that's also to decode our own, fiscal math back home. Jahangir, great to have you with us. While perhaps hopes that a stimulus will be announced this week are keeping markets afloat, we did see the borrowing numbers come in on Friday, and those were a bit of a shocker. The entire COVID imbroglio has already led the government to clearly push up that borrowing target. What are you making of the numbers, and how tricky is it looking already?
Hi, morning. Look, the numbers came almost identical to what we had been forecasting for at least about a couple of weeks. So broadly, if you look at center and state deficit last year, that it was about 7% of GDP. So 3% was added in the center's additional borrowing program, and we are expecting another 1% fiscal slippage on the part of the state. So that takes you to about 11% of GDP. And in general, over the last few years, the government has, borrowed about 2.5% off budget through public sector undertakings. So essentially, we're looking at a public sector borrowing program of around 13.5% of GDP. Now, the difference between what the government has and what we have, even though our numbers are almost identical, is that in our numbers, it's not almost, but it's entirely because of slippage in revenue. There is absolutely no increase in spending. So any kind of COVID-related spending or stimulus that the market is looking for has to be offset by spending elsewhere. If not, then the 13.5% GDP borrowing program, that will rise even higher. Okay,
so that's an interesting insight, Jahangir. I want to then understand, we're watching out for the stimulus. Everyone's wondering, first of all, why it's taken them so long to come up with this. We're also anticipating, a round of credit guarantees, cash support, so on and so forth, an MSME package, for example. Is that going to be enough? Because it still doesn't sound like the kind of push or the kind of intensity that perhaps we have been, anticipating from a market or corporate standpoint.
Look, the question of enough is a very difficult question to answer. We don't even know what the size of the shock is going to be. You saw the apocalyptic decline in PMIs in April. We have never seen PMIs at those levels. And the services PMI was, it's almost unimaginable that you could have a PMI number that low. And services is the largest part of the Indian economy. So we don't even know what the size of the shock is going to be. Therefore, any kind of estimation or contemplation of that this is the right size, that is the wrong size, it doesn't really work. What you have to figure out is what is the kind of support that is required, and B, that support has to be driven by the size of the economic shock. Now, the kind of support that is required, we know some things about it. In almost all financial crises, including the last financial crisis, the global financial crisis, or any other banking crisis across the world, the thing that stops a recovery from taking place is when households and firms, especially SMEs' balance sheets get impaired. So what is really required in form of stimulus is a massive amount of income support to both household balance sheet and to SMEs and to corporates. I don't think that we know very much what the size of these amounts will be. And as I said, whatever stimulus that we are providing in terms of the virus-related stimulus has to be offset by spending cuts elsewhere. And for people who think that we should actually have higher spending, I think they need to look at they need to have a reality check. India, getting 13.5% of GDP funded from the private sector, it's going to be a very, very tough call. We have at most funded about 6 to 7% of GDP in the past. We are asking for a doubling of resources from the private sector if that's the way we are planning to fund even the 13-14% of GDP in public sector borrowing.
Good morning.
Morning. I just wanted to get in your take as to what the outlook could be with respect to the fiscal gap. Given the potential access to alternative sources like T-bills, national savings, etc., do you think that the kind of additional borrowings that we saw suggest that the magnitude of the FY21 fiscal gap at this time could be even larger than the 7 to 8 lakh crores that we've been working with or that have been projected?
Yeah, I mean, look, again, it depends on the size of the shock, depends on how much the revenue shortfall is going to be, and obviously depends on what the government actually decides to do with the stimulus. And it could easily be higher than that. And in terms of funding that kind of very large fiscal deficit, and this is, by the way, is true for every country that we are looking at. For example, India's peers in the emerging market world, South Africa, Brazil, all have fiscal deficits that are doubling. So in the case of Brazil and South Africa, it's 14.5% of GDP, both countries, and they had similar size fiscal deficit with India last year. So this is not a phenomenon that only India is facing. It's faced, every emerging market country is facing the same phenomenon, a massive increase in fiscal deficit. And really the only solution is that the central banks buy government bonds. It's quantitative easing. Now, the amount of quantitative easing that the RBI will have to do, that depends on what other things that they are planning to do. If they are able to extend forbearance with the banks, saying that the banks do not have to mark to market their bond holdings, maybe the banks will, use some of the 7 trillion odd excess liquidity in the interbank market to buy some government bonds. They can go and make, cash reserve ratio actually payable only in bonds. There are other things that they can do to reduce the amount of quantitative easing, but without quantitative easing, and that too by a very large amount, it is unimaginable that any of these emerging market countries, and India is just part of that, can, finance this massive increase in fiscal deficit by borrowing from the private sector.
All right, Jahangir, we'll let you go on that note. Appreciate your time. Thanks very much for assessing the situation with respect to the government borrowing and the macros.